Alrighty. So now I'm going to start with the video to get more people to log in.
Refusing to Forget is an award-winning public history project that works to increase general awareness of the history of state-sanctioned racial violence in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Between 1910 and 1920, ethnic Mexicans living on the Texas-Mexico border were targets of such violence. They were most often killed by the Texas Rangers, county law enforcement, and U.S. soldiers. Although historians estimate that over 1,000 ethnic Mexicans were killed, this chapter in Texas history has received scant public attention.
We have pursued a multifaceted public history project in an effort to ensure that these atrocities are remembered and discussed as part of the American historical inheritance. This includes a large exhibit at the Bullock State History Museum of Texas, the approval and erection of 4 historical markers that describe the violence and efforts to resist it, and public programming and memorialization events centered on some of the key sites and anniversaries of this tragic history.
Professors John Moran Gonzalez, Sonia Hernandez, Benjamin Johnson, Monica Munoz Martinez, Trinidad Gonzalez, and Christopher Carbona collaborate to bring public awareness to the long history of anti-Mexican violence in Texas and the long struggle for justice and civil rights along the U.S.-Mexico border. Despite numerous publications, this history continued to be forgotten, or worse, celebrated in public history and popular culture. Working with cultural institutions, teachers, journalists, and descendants of racist violence, we have designed public history projects that provide truthful accountings of the past, foster urgent public dialogue, and provide opportunities for healing and repair.
Over 90 years ago, a border native and the only Mexican American serving in the state legislature, Jose Tomas Canales, called for an investigation into state-sanctioned violence unleashed on the predominantly Mexican origin community in the state's southern border with Tamaulipas and Nuevo León. The 1919 Canales investigation into Texas Ranger violence and its civil rights legacy finally was publicly recognized in the spring of 2019. With the support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and numerous other entities, Refusing to Forget organized a conference to mark the centennial of the Canales investigation. The call for an investigation by this Brownsville attorney and member of the Tejano elite was prompted by the widespread killing of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals working and residing in South Texas during the 1910-1920 period. Harper's Weekly reported that the killing of these ethnic Mexicans made it seem as, quote, if it were open gun season on Mexicans, end of quote. Using the pretext of a potential foreign invasion of revolutionary bandits, law enforcement and common residents alike took matters into their own hands, resulting in the indiscriminate killing of thousands. The conference, Reverberations of Memory, Violence, and History, the centennial of the 1919 Canales investigation, placed this traumatic event in the nation's history at the center of a public conversation. This public conversation, in expanded form, is featured in a scholarly anthology entitled Reverberations of Racial Violence, Critical Reflections on the History of the Border, published by UT Austin Press in 2021. This research has begun to shift the public conversation about the way in which we study violence and civil rights, about community resilience, and about our state's role in encouraging violence.
At every public history event, we are asked, when will this history be taught in public schools? Refusing to Forget members have made presentations to teachers, provided oral history workshops for students, developed educational videos, created a lesson plan on the life of Jovita Hidad, and collaborated with teachers. Mr. Juan Carmona in Donna, Texas, and his students helped recover lost primary sources and have made research presentations at important commemorative events. But this history should be available and taught to all students in Texas.
The importance of continuing this work is vital for future generations and those descendants of violence to know what happened here, to know that our history is a vital part of U.S. history. For the past 100 years, most of this history has been whispered and told from generation to generation so that they will remember. But over time, these stories have started to fade, and the best way to keep this history alive is to record it for all posterity. The work of Refusing to Forget is not just about recording the events of the past, but to help in the healing of those affected by the violence of the Texas Rangers and those agencies which took so much in the name of American progress.
They say this is a forgotten history. But for those of us who are descendants, like myself, we learned this history from our parents, from our grandparents. We learned about how our ancestors were shot and killed, left out to rot. This is a history that should not be forgotten. That's why we refuse to forget. It's time for the state of Texas to confront this history in a truthful manner so that we can have a reconciliation for all of us.
This work is possible thanks to the generations of witnesses and survivors who refused to be intimidated, who left personal records documenting racial terror, who shared their stories with their children, and those who passed memories from one generation to the next. They helped make sure that the names of victims like Antonio Rodriguez, Antonio Longoria, Jesus Bazan, Concepcion Garcia, Longino Flores, and Paulina Cerda would not be forgotten. They call on all of us to refuse to forget and to call out racial injustice in all its forms today.
Refusing to forget.
All right. I'm sorry. Trying to stop it. Go ahead.
Okay. Good evening. We'd like to welcome everybody that's joined us tonight. Thank you for taking some time to join this important conversation. I am Cecilia Bailly. I'm a journalist here in Texas and a visiting scholar at the University of Houston. I'm going to let the panelists and featured scholars introduce themselves before we get into some of this discussion. So Ben, can you start us off?
Yes, I'm Ben Johnson. I'm a professor of history at Loyola University in Chicago.
Hi, I'm Christopher Carmona. I am a professor of Mexican American Studies and Creative Writing at UTRGV.
I'm John Moran Gonzalez. I'm the J. Frank Dobie Regents Professor of American and English Literature at the University.
Hello, everyone. My name is Monica Martinez, and I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin.
Hello, everyone. Buenas noches. I'm Sonia Hernandez. I'm an associate professor in the Department of History and a faculty affiliate of the Latino and Mexican American Studies program at Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas.
Hi, everyone. My name is Trey Gonzalez. I'm a history and Mexican American Studies instructor at South Texas College, as well as being a descendant of somebody who was killed during the Matanza. As part of Refusing to Forget, I'd like to thank everybody who's attending, especially a shout out to Cecilia for hosting us tonight. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I used to teach at UT Austin, and I've been a big fan of these 6 scholars that you're seeing and are going to hear from tonight. As you'll see, it's a really knowledgeable group that has been in conversation for many years about initiating this important project, and they've now been working officially as a group for 8 years and still have a lot of projects and ideas for the future. So I want to remind you that tonight's event is also a fundraiser, and the goal is to try to raise $20,000 so that the team can continue to move forward with some of its new projects and taking this information, these exhibits, this curriculum to new communities and audiences. They'll be describing their planned projects a bit more, but I'd like to just point you to the chat where there's a link for you to donate anytime during this conversation, anytime after the event. But to encourage you to support us right now during this event and get the momentum going, we have some special treats for the first 15 people who send a donation. The scholars on this board have generously donated some of their books, including the most recent book that's an anthology of some texts that emerged from a conference around refusing to forget. And so that is one of the many good books on the list. So we just want to encourage you to, like I said, just help out however you can, to whatever degree you can. It's going to a really important cause. So we'll go ahead and start the conversation. And I'd like this group to share with us first how and why they decided to form a public history project. They're all very busy academics in their own universities. They all teach full-time. They all do and publish their own research. None of that has changed as they've worked on this project. Can you explain to us why it felt so important to expand yourselves and give of your time for many years to these activities? Monica, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. Well, again, I wanted to thank everybody for joining us, and we shared a video that provided a little bit of information about the history of anti-Mexican violence. But when Refusing to Forget came together as a group of scholars, we were all paying attention to the rising centennial of anti-Mexican violence, the peak of anti-Mexican violence in 2015 that was approaching. And so in 2013 and even earlier, we started having conversations with one another. But finally, in 2014, decided to form a nonprofit to help commemorate the history of anti-Mexican violence in the early 20th century. Most people don't know about the history of anti-Mexican violence. This was a history that was state-sanctioned racial violence by law enforcement, by Texas Rangers, by US soldiers, and also by vigilantes. And as historians and scholars of this period, we realize that hundreds, if not thousands, of victims of anti-Mexican violence in this era were denied justice. Instead, aggressors were not prosecuted. They were actually celebrated by historians, but also in public history. And so we realized that as scholars, we had a responsibility to addressing calls by generations of descendants, but also of witnesses to violence who had been calling for this history to be acknowledged and condemned. And we also wanted to commemorate and celebrate Texans who had called for social justice 100 years ago and throughout the 20th century. And so we collaborated with different institutions to help to make these histories public. But that's the impetus to contribute to keeping these histories alive, to shaping public conversations about not only the past, but also the current moment, was what really mobilized us to get out of just writing history books and get involved with public history.
And as Monica has indicated, it's not that these events were unknown to professional historians or to the descendants of those who were murdered. Much has been said and written, but usually this has been confined to academic venues or to family circles. So we wanted to bring back these events to public consciousness as a widespread awareness about these events, because the public awareness of state violence against ethnic Mexicans is a part of Texas history and of US history. We also desired to influence media reporting about this kind of racial violence, such that reporters broaden their understanding and therefore their audience's understanding of when and where it occurred outside the Deep South, and to provide a contemporary context for it.
Thank you, John. I think probably most people can relate to my own experience. Probably every panelist here, we didn't have any idea of this history when we were taught Texas history in the classroom, right? So it very much feels like new information to most people. And as you say, it's really important to rewrite or to write sometimes for the first time this story that's so important to the formation of Texas and to our own origins as a state. I also wanted to get now into just some of your goals. From the beginning, you decided that this needed to be a multifaceted effort, as you mentioned before, that you had to target schools and scholarship and public monuments. So can you take us through some of those activities that you worked on and what their effect was?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll start on this. So, one of the first goals we pursued was a museum exhibit, and this just kind of made sense from the beginning and was in our conversations. Museums are trusted by the public as reliable sources of historical information. They attract visitors from a wider range of the public than those we see in our college classrooms and who might read our books in classes. And our dream venue really was the Bullock Museum of Texas History. It has a great location, as many of you know, between UT Austin's campus and the Capitol building. It does visually attractive and engaging exhibits, and it has attracted millions of visitors since its opening in 2001. So we kind of had these conferences, talked to one another, and we called them up and pitched this idea, and they were open to it and really actually excited about it. And so over the next year and a half or so, we worked closely with their staff in developing an exhibit, and we were very pleased by that collaboration. The exhibit was ultimately called Life and Death on the Border. And on the one hand, it was unflinching, right? It named specific rangers, it used the word murder, but on the other hand, it avoided presenting people from South Texas as simple victims. Instead, it introduced the long history of the region and engaged the audience with artifacts like family Bibles and wedding dresses. And it also conveyed, as Monica kind of alluded to earlier, the stories of people, both Anglo and Mexican, who tried to stop the violence. The exhibit ran in a temporary space at the Bullock for 10 weeks, starting in January 2016. According to the Bullock, it attracted about 50,000 visitors. It generated great coverage in Latina Magazine, The Guardian, Slate, and other outlets. We had a lot of great conversations with teachers and students around the exhibit. We saw many members of descendant families at the exhibit and at the opening roundtable. And it was especially gratifying to us that some showed their trust in us and in the Bullock by lending the Bullock family pictures for display, which then became part of the exhibit. So I think it's fair to say it succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. We started planning a traveling version of the exhibit, but lacked at the time the bandwidth and money to generate one, a goal that maybe we can come back to later.
Thank you. Chris, can you tell us about the public markers that you have been involved with?
You're muted, Chris.
I think you're
I
muted.
just realized that. So yeah, one of the goals of Refusing to Forget has been really to erect the different historical markers around the state of Texas to really talk about the I guess the other histories that have not been shared as in public sites. And so far we've had 4 markers erected around the state of Texas, 2 of them in the Valley, which is one in Hidalgo County, which references the LaGuardia Bazan murders, the other in Brownsville, or between Brownsville and San Benito, which basically is a commemoration of the entire Matanza of 1915. We have the went out toward El Paso for the Porvenir massacre that happened in 1918. And then of course we also got one erected for Jovita Edad, who was a champion of Mexican Americans during this time. And she was a reporter, a teacher, and she did a lot of work to bring this information out. The fact that the Mexicans at this time were being targeted and lynched and murdered by the Texas Rangers and others, state-sponsored types of vigilantes and such at this time. So, part of the reason for bringing these markers around is because it's a public acknowledgement by the state of Texas that these histories happened. And also to commemorate people that are not usually commemorated, because people like Jovita Edad and others who have helped to, against a lot of this violence and help to bring resilience into the community. You know, Jovita that you know, she was involved heavily in education, and she helped start a lot of, you know, escuelitas and things are in the Rio Grande Valley, as well as when she moved to San Antonio, she did a lot of that kind of work there. So these are the kind of people that we want to try to kind of make sure that they're publicly on, you know, physically on the lands, so that, you know, anybody driving by or wherever can see these. And so this is kind of one of the major important aspects of what Refusing to Forget tries to do when we push forward the public history aspect of this.
I love that thought of the markers, because you're literally marking the land with and reminding people and forcing people to know this is the geography of the violence. And for people who don't know, getting a public marker is no easy task. It involves so much research, gathering of documents, and some would also say it involves having the right political moment or people on the board that are going to support it and approve it. So you'll hear a little later how much work that was in some of these cases. And the ride was not a smooth one. But at this point, just want to say that we are getting donations coming in, and we want to thank you for that. I think we have 7 people who've sent in donations. That's so important for this work to continue. So just want to encourage others to do the same. Monica, do you want to talk to us about some of your work with educators?
Certainly. Well, you know, glad to see Mr. Juan Carmona joined us this evening. One of the great things about the Bullock and collaborating with the Bullock is also because it is a teaching institution. Hundreds of thousands of students visit the Bullock to take tours of, you know, school field trips. And so we recognized in collaborating with the Bullock that we were going to be learning also how to provide resources for educators. And so different members of the group provided lectures for teachers. We actually, at the unveiling of the Bullock exhibit, we had a follow-up session, because we had teachers come from Uvalde CISD, which is my hometown, that took buses to come to for the unveiling weekend. So we've had different opportunities to collaborate, like I said, with people like Mr. Juan Carmona and Donna, and also some of the descendants of anti-Mexican violence are teachers and educators. And every time we give presentations, that's nearly always the first question: how do we get this history into the classrooms? And so one of the things that we did is create a lesson plan. I worked with some students at Brown University, some who had teaching experience, other who are majoring in education to become teachers, and we created a lesson plan that actually took the marker for Jovita as inspiration, to organize teaching primary documents, to teach students how to conduct oral histories with their own families, but also to take a field trip, whether a virtual field trip or an in-person field trip, to visit the marker of Jovita. And so we've continued as building a part of our work in addition to our professional roles, but thinking creatively about how to create resources for teachers. And in looking forward, that is one thing that we want to continue to build. We need more than one lesson plan, and we need, and teachers are asking for resources. And so we really want to put our time and effort and some dollars behind creating those resources for them. And students, I just have to say that one of the most rewarding things has been in these collaborations, getting to meet students, middle school children, high school students who are inspired by the history and who are confronting difficult histories, but say how it helps them process how they understand the world today, how they understand the border, how they understand policing, and how they understand their role in creating a democracy, an inclusive democracy. And so it's, you know, we're thinking about not just teachers, but also students and our role in providing them resources.
Thank you, Monica. Trini, can you talk a bit about your engagement with media? From what I understand, you've gotten a lot more engagement than you even expected, and not just around some of the events that you have promoted, but in general, people who are journalists who are seeking more context when they're writing stories. I know we have at least a couple journalists that I know that are on this call, probably a few more, but share with us a little bit about how that's been.
Okay. Yes, and it's been welcome, particularly as a former journalist. I started out as a went down the path of an academic in history. The way we were getting to a wider audience was through these requests for interviews about this history. Almost all the journalists indicated were not aware of this history. They want to know why they were not aware of this history. And then there was also a desire to learn more about this history from their readers or viewers. I mean, I was interviewed by the BBC for a morning show in London, right? I was interviewed by a Danish reporter who's based in Mexico City because the story had stretched out to Europe somehow through either social media or some other networks, right? But most importantly, I think those of us who are descendants, those of us who are aware of this history through our sort of stories told for generation to generation, it was important to see this in print, right? And one thing I want to circle back to, particularly to the Matanza marker, but all the other markers as well, is that we have a blessing at the beginning of the Matanza marker unveiling, specifically to make it sacred, right? Because many people didn't get to bury their descendants. I mean, the people who were killed, excuse me. And it was very important as humans that we respect the dignity of burial and remembrance for those, right? So when the marker went up and we saw the bouquet of flowers for the Day of Dead this year, that was like, it was amazing, but it's something we knew that needed to be done, right? And this is part of the healing process, these markers, getting the story out and getting the wider public to be aware of it as well, so that we can have greater conversations about what kind of society we want to be and where do we want to move forward with.
Well, and I love what you said about this being so important to the descendants for this to appear in these public venues and in print or on television. And I'd also say as a journalist that those of us in media understand how much power we have in crafting the public narrative. And there's a conversation nationally about the real hard structural effects of public narratives and the fact that entire communities or individuals have been left out of crafting those narratives in the past. So creating these stories that circulate then and reach more people is really critical work, really critical discursive work. Can Sonia and John, can you kind of round out this reflection on events and activities by talking to us about the scholarship that's emerged around this?
Yes, thank you, Cecilia, and thank you for being here with us, and thanks to everyone as well. We're just absolutely thrilled that the National Endowment for the Humanities, the NEH, a premier humanities entity, believed in our project. And so with NEH funding, we were able to organize in 2019 a conference that marked the centennial of the very first state-led investigation into Texas Ranger violence led by Jose Tomas Canales, better known as JT Canales. And for us, this is really important. This is a really nice follow-up from the 2016 Bullock exhibit that Ben talked about. We just kept building momentum, and it was very special for us that we were able to not only acknowledge the narratives, the stories, the testimonios of the descendants and featured in the conference, but sort of combine those two, these powerful, very personal, intimate stories that have been kept alive generation after generation, and bring together also scholars, right, who, perhaps didn't have any direct connection, but, bringing these two groups together and, spending 2 or 3 days reflecting upon the Canales investigation, which produced some 1,600 pages of testimony. This is a state document, and it's pretty hard to refute this history. And so we were just, thrilled to have everyone, engage in this conversation. And this last summer, the University of Texas at Austin Press published the anthology, Reverberations of Racial Violence, Critical Reflections on the History of the Border, featuring 14 essays. And John, I'll pass it on to John, who can talk a little bit about the chapters in this anthology.
Well, it was my great pleasure, Cecilia, to work with Sonia as co-editor of this volume of Reverberations of Racial Violence. And as Sonia has indicated, we brought together uh, uh, contributors to the from the conference together in a scholarly volume to be able to kind of get the word out about the Canales investigation in larger scholarly circles and to the wider public. So as Sonia mentioned, there are 14 chapters, but actually we have 24 contributors to this. So many of the articles or chapters are specifically about the investigation or the context of for Mexican ethnic Mexicans in Texas in that era. So, but many others also look towards a comparative framework of looking at how state violence or mob violence played out against other groups within the United States, but also in Mexico, as lynching is not confined to the U.S., but rather is a phenomenon all too common in other places as well. But essentially, we also we're fortunate to have some of the contributors on in attendance tonight, like Phyllis Barragan Getz of the University of Texas A&M San Antonio. I'd also like to mention that we had several two poems that bookended the volume. One by Noreen Rivera of UT RGV, and one by Nati Roman of San Antonio College. And, you know, because we also wanted to emphasize the fact that it's in our expressive culture. It's an expressive culture where the stories have often been kept alive. And we wanted to kind of emphasize that and have it in conversation with the more scholarly texts. In any case, it's an amazing volume. I think everyone on this on the panel contributed, in addition to leading scholars and wonderful poets. And we had the eminent historian Antonio Castañeda write the foreword, and John Philip Santos, another well-known writer, did the afterword. And we're really excited about this volume. And, you know, we're really happy to make it part of the public conversation about these events.
John, I love what you said about how some of this history was recorded early on, but through expressive culture, right? So before we had scholars such as all of you in the academy doing the historical work, some of your own scholarship looks at corridos and how these old folk ballads were recording the events as they were happening. I want to take a moment now just to name a couple of the awards that you've received. There's been a lot of recognition for your efforts from scholarship associations. I know that you received the 2021 Friend of History Award from the Organization of American Historians, which recognizes an institution or organization for the public presentation of American history. You also received the 2019 Herbert Feist Award for distinguished contributions to public history, which comes from the American History Association. You've received the Autry Public History Prize from the Western History Association, and you also received a Leadership in History Award of Merit, which came from the American Association for State and Local History. So all these different organizations of historians who've recognized not just the importance of this work publicly, but also the scholarly weight, kind of how solid this work is, and it's based on a lot of evidence that you've collected over the years and a lot of really fresh and critical analysis. Monica, do you want to share a bit about what that means for you as a group?
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, I think that we were always blown away. The first award came for the collaboration with the Bullock Museum for the exhibit Life and Death on the Border. And that it just felt like a tremendous honor. And as we saw, awards kept coming for the ongoing efforts. I wanted to say that, when we sort of think about and reflect on the proposals for awards and the awards that we received, we realized that this work was being celebrated by professional associations because they were recognizing the importance of historians working to share history, difficult, challenging histories with public audiences, to commemorate histories that had been ignored or worse, celebrated, and really, as I said, getting outside of the books, outside of the classroom, and bringing the history to the public. We also realized that Refusing to Forget was being celebrated for our work collaborating with cultural institutions like the Bullock Museum and like the Texas Historical Commission. As you alluded to earlier, these public projects have taken years to bring to fruition. The Bullock Museum exhibit was only up for 10 weeks, and that took 3 years of consistent effort. The historical markers, some of them like the Bodnid massacre, the marker for the double murder of Jesus Bazan and Antonio Longoria, those took multiple years of reapplying and then multiple years of actually seeing the process through. And so these awards were celebrations of not only our collaboration as historians, but also our collaborations with institutions, cultural institutions that had refused for a century to participate in acknowledging this history and making it accessible to the public. And recognizing that there are different stakeholders. And for us, an important group that we had to be in conversation with and learn from were the descendants of racist violence, people who were descendants of the Bodnid massacre, like Benita Alvarado, and her husband, Evaristo Alvarado, who is joining us, is with us this evening. Thank you so much for being with us. And also people like Melba Kuti and her daughter, Christine Molis, and other descendants of the Bazan and Longoria double murder, people like Norma Longoria Rodriguez, these descendants who had been working for generations to not only preserve the histories of anti-Mexican violence that their families suffered, but had also been calling for the histories to be acknowledged and to be reckoned with. And so that is a group that had been long overlooked and in many cases dismissed by cultural institutions. And so we were not the first people to submit a historical marker application or to recommend a historical marker for the Bodnid massacre, for example. And so in part, what we have come to hold on to is that these awards are in recognition of our working and collaborating with multiple groups and acknowledging the importance of public history, not only to inform the public, but to provide opportunities for public healing, as Trini referenced before. And I can't say also enough how important it is that Trini is a member of the group and as a descendant is always pushing us to consider the multiple publics that we are working with and considering that have too often been overlooked. We're lucky also to have Adelinda Valencia with us this evening. She's going to join the panel. She is the descendant of victims of the Bodnid massacre. Her great-grandfather, Lonquino Flores, was murdered at the massacre. Her great-grandmother, Juana Bonilla Flores, and her aunt was Rosa Flores Mesa. They were survivors of the massacre. And she has also created public commemorations of the Bodnid massacre on the centennial of the anniversary and created a website to commemorate not only the victims, but also the survivors, and has been pushing for public acknowledgement. So I'd like to welcome Adelinda for joining us, and Cecilia, I think you had a question for her.
Yes, well, Arlinda, I wanted you to share with us kind of, a little bit of your testimony and what this has meant for you to, I mean, you have been working on this. If this team has been doing this 8 years, you know, you spent a lifetime pushing forward the story and trying to get people to listen and to take with more seriousness this other aspect of history that had never been told. So what has it meant for you to be involved with a group? What has it meant to your family? Can you tell us a little bit about your experience?
Yes, first of all, I want to thank Refusing to Forget. You guys are phenomenal, and your work is just, it's so appreciated. We really do appreciate all the hard work that you guys have done, all the descendants. There's not anyone out there that would say that you guys are just, you're rubies. That's all I can tell you. You're diamonds. The thing that I want to say is the descendants just want the story out. That's all we want. This story was hidden for so many years, and all of a sudden it started coming out. And to find out 75 years after the event of what actually happened on January 28, 1918, is just, it was very surprising. And the descendants, a lot of the descendants didn't know. My family didn't know. And we actually found out through our great Tío Juan. And so the thing is that we want everyone to understand that history is important. That's number one. Everything has history. That's the thing that no one seems to grasp. You cannot live without knowing the history of what happened, even inventions. Why do we have to know who invented electricity, you know, or the light bulb? Those are just stories that come out. Why do we remember the Alamo? Come on. Why is it that we can remember the Alamo, but we can't remember the massacre that happened at Fort Vinith? It's just what people want out there. And I've got to tell you that we've got to get these stories out so that people understand. It's a way to understand our society. It does correlate to learning right from wrong. And right now, I know I'm from Texas. They just passed House Bill 3979, which is totally bans the teaching of critical race theory. And we just, come on, there's not a right and a wrong of the Holocaust. So you know, with your work, I believe that you can, if you guys are banding a lot of people together to where we can fight and we can actually make a difference. And there's not too many groups like that. And so I just want to thank you guys from the bottom of my heart that you guys are doing a wonderful job. And as a descendant, we cannot thank you enough for all that you do. And we will, whatever we can do to help you, all you have to do is you can just call me, because I will be there with bells on to help you do what you're doing. Thank you.
I just wanted to follow up and say thank you so much, Arlinda, and also to say that Arlinda has collaborated with teachers in El Paso and created a lesson plan on the Fort Vinith massacre and teacher resources. And she has a lot in common also with Norma Longoria Rodriguez, who is a descendant of the Jesus Pazan and Antonio Longoria double murder, and lives in San Antonio and is also a retired teacher. And so much of our also calls of reaching out to educators is informed by some of the descendants that we've worked with. I also wanted to say that, you know, the award for the Bullock Museum exhibit, for example, couldn't have been possible if it wasn't for the descendants like Norma Longoria Rodriguez and Benita Alvarado and Melba Cootie. And it has been a hard year for our team to have lost Mrs. Alvarado and Mrs. Cootie. And so, you know, so much of the work that we're doing is in honor of families and generations who have been calling for this history to make them public, but also is thanks to the generosity of descendants who have opened up their personal archives of photographs, of documents, have given us the names of people who were murdered, and the family members that survived them. Cultural institutions, not only in Texas, but across the country, failed to preserve these histories. And so we are, all of what we have done has been in collaboration with descendants. And really, I just wanted to say thank you to Arlinda, but also to the other collaborators who are joining us this evening.
Thank you.
We will, in 10 or 15 minutes, be opening up for a conversation, questions and answers. And if there are any other descendants with us today that want to share a little bit what your experience has been, we'd welcome that, of course. And I also don't want to sound like a saleswoman, but I want to remind you again that this is a fundraiser as well for Refusing to Forget. And I want to take a moment to recognize some of the individuals that have already pledged to support the group. And I apologize in advance if I mispronounce anyone's names, but we have Ricardo Carmona, David McKenzie, Torres McNeil, Max Crochmo, Janie Camaro, Christine Molis, Rebecca Newdecker. All 7 of them have already pledged to support this group, and we're very grateful. And we can't wait to put some books in the mail and send them your way. You'll really enjoy them. I want to turn over now to ask the panelists to reflect a little bit on kind of the highs and lows. This has been a long trajectory, probably a little bit of a roller coaster ride, I imagine. I haven't seen the behind the scenes, but can you share a little bit about some of the most meaningful moments for you, the high moments, and also some of the sobering ones or the challenges that you have faced or continue to face at this moment as you move forward? John, do you want to get us started?
Yes, I sure can, Cecilia. I still remember the moments that, going into the Bullock Texas State History Museum for the exhibit, and really kind of just astonished at what we were able to accomplish with the help of so many there at the museum and descendants as well. But it was like stepping into a set of history, right? I mean, the Bullock calls itself The Story of Texas, right? And a chapter that should have been there from the beginning, but hadn't been, was there at least for a brief moment. And but I think the idea that we were able to kind of help in this transformative manner, I mean, and even the kind of touches, curatorial touches that, often get overlooked, were really important. So I'll just mention one briefly. The fact that we insisted and got all the explanatory text for the exhibit was bilingual, that is in English and Spanish. And because of course the language that that text is in really speaks to the publics you're hoping to reach. And we wanted to be sure that that it would be at least bilingual in nature. So together with that, the exhibit, through the conference that we held, we reached over 40,000 folks with the exhibit. And then we reached, for the conference, it was smaller, of course, but it was still several hundred people. And it just spoke to the kind of possibilities. I'll add to that the marker unveiling events where we had conferences in conjunction with the marker unveilings. And it was just an amazing feeling to be able to share that moment with so many people from our communities, with descendants, and with folks, all those who are interested in the truth in history.
Trini, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah. So the Matanza marker, which I referenced earlier, was important for me because my daughter was 2 months old or that marker unveiling. So when I was presenting the descendants, who were also my aunt and uncle and my cousins who attended the marker unveiling, it was special because it was something I shared with my 2-month-old, who is now 4 and doesn't want to come out on the show. So she's right here. That's why you see me doing this. That's what's going on with my daughter, who's attended many RTF events and meetings, by the way, in her 4 years of life. That was special because, growing up, I heard the stories early on, right? My dad told me about my great-grandfather, Paulino, and his father, Don Anciano, being killed by the Rangers. And my mother talked about how my great-grandmother then had to bring her family into the city of Edinburgh. My grandmother was about 1 year and 3 months old when her father was killed and her mother was killed. So I grew up with these stories. We go to the cemetery at Laguna Seca where they're buried and help take care of their graves. Also, we would dig the holes when relatives would pass away and they'd be buried at Laguna Seca. Unfortunately, I can't get into the cemetery anymore and tell my daughter this is where your relatives are buried because the cemetery, the ranch has been bought out by a different family. But the marker itself, it can work as a site where I can share that story as a father to a daughter about her family's history and and efforts we've engaged in as a community RTF, but the larger RTF family, right, which is the descendants and the collaborators and all the other people we've met in this journey of trying to seek the truth presented in an accurate way and hopefully get the state to take much more seriously and moving away from the two-sidedness of the story, right? There's no two sides to the Matanza. There's no two sides to Porvenir. There's one side. It was wrong. Unfortunately, defenders of the Rangers still want to present it as two sides. So that was a special moment for me as a father.
Thank you for sharing that very personal anecdote, Trini. Chris, do you want to share anything with us?
Sure. So just to kind of, I guess, piggyback off what Trini was talking about. I mean, I got into this work because of my grandfather, who told me the stories of the Rinches when I was a kid. And also, my great-grandfather, who had to take his entire family, my grandfather and everybody, into Mexico for 2 years in the middle of the Mexican Revolution because the violence over here was so bad. And so, luckily we didn't lose family members to the Matanza, but we were affected by what happened there, and that stuck with my grandfather until so doing this work in a lot of ways really commemorates his memory and what he went through and his family and our family has gone through. And but to kind of go back to what Arlinda was talking about with the bills, right? And so for the past few years, we have been, myself, Trini, and others have been working on getting these Mexican American Studies classes into the school board, into the schools. And we were successful. In 2019 was the first ever Mexican American Studies course in the state of Texas, approved, state board approved course. And last year we got the African American Studies course. And so we've been making progress over the past 6 or 7 years of doing this work. And of course, this session, we have the legislature passing these bills to limit this teaching, to limit the successes that we have done. And that, and then what's been going around the country at this time, but we did have Cristina Morales, who's the representative out of Houston, who did actually have a bill on the floor to make Mexican American Studies count toward graduation rates. It actually passed the Texas House, but it was not brought up to a vote for the Senate. But it was the first ethnic studies bills of its kind to ever pass the House in Texas. Now, Christina is going to reintroduce that bill in the next session. But as we see now, there are all of these bills like 3979 and others who are trying to limit this teaching of these histories, these truths in the classroom, right? Because that's what we're talking about, is teaching truths about history out there. And so I continue, I was on the floor when these bills were being debated this past summer, and saw what was being discussed, and it's really, there were a lot of people who showed up to testify against these bills, and so yeah, I mean, so I just wanted to go and make sure that that's part of the work that we do here. It's about bringing these stories out. I mean, and a lot of the stories we tell and a lot of the work we do, even just by, getting involved in getting these bills, getting these classes out there, are extremely important to the work that we do here.
It strikes me how, as you said early on, your group came together because of a centennial that was coming up. But the timing of the project, it seems like with every year that passes, it just becomes more and more relevant to the present moment. And the other thing that struck me as you were speaking is 5 of the 6 of you grew up in South Texas, in these different cities and places that are where these communities exist, that have not healed from these terrible historical experiences of violence. So it's very much a personal drive as much as a scholarly one, I imagine, for all of you to be engaged in this for so long. I will go ahead and just wrap up now by asking you to share with us some of the events, the activities that you have in mind for the future. And on that note, I also want to thank another donor, Deb Vargas, who is a wonderful scholar in her own right. Thank you for the contribution. And we also have had some other donors that asked us not to share their name, but we're equally grateful for your support. But in closing, Sonia, do you want to start by sharing some of your plans?
Yes, thank you, Cecilia. I think Chris, just going back to some of the comments that Chris shared and training, I mean, this is so urgent. So in order for us to continue this work, for Refusing to Forget, to continue this work and continue to collaborate, we need support. So thank you so much for those of you who have donated thus far, and we encourage you to keep supporting our mission. And so we want to continue our programming in sort of 5 general areas. So one is a traveling exhibit. So what we would like to do is to work on a traveling version of the exhibit based on the 2016 Bullock exhibit to reach wider audiences. Collaborating with small, medium, large cultural institutions, universities, colleges, with the hopes of people from those areas to come out and share their stories, and even potentially share cultural artifacts, family archives, photographs, very much like what happened in the 2016 exhibit. Especially now with, as Chris pointed out, the censorship bills, this is where the public will, particularly the youth, will get this history, and educators, which I'll loop back to that point in a bit. So we're hoping to do the traveling exhibits. We also would like to continue our activism with respect to the marker program, submitting marker applications, resubmitting those that were not successful, like the marker for Antonio Rodriguez out in Edwards County, the brutal lynching of a very young individual, Antonio Rodriguez, in 1910. And so we're hoping to do that and continue also helping others, individuals and entities as well, work on marker applications. We also plan to revamp our website, adding more content, and not only as sort of like a standalone archive, but also to provide resources for teachers, educators, journalists, and the greater public, and also working to increase our social media presence. With respect to educators, I mean, this is this is so important. We have to collaborate with public educators. They are really feeling the pressure. There are ways to sort of navigate these bills. Some of this history, I think, thinking creatively, I think educators can still sort of address some of this really critical history. And so we feel that RTF has a responsibility to those educators And teachers need those resources, and they need our help. And so we're planning to, with your support, with your help, we're planning to continue that as well. We still struggle with, despite the fact that there's so much evidence-based scholarship on this START chapter in our state and in our history, there are museums like the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame Museum that continue to rely on, the old Ranger hero story, and they continue to gloss over evidence-based scholarship. It is time for them to keep up with the new scholarship, and it is time for them to provide a much more inclusive and, frankly, just a truthful account of the Texas Rangers. So one of the things that we want to do with your support is to plan a series of events around the bicentennial of the Texas Ranger Force, but approaching these events from a critical perspective, from a much more truthful standpoint, and one that also takes into account the stories and the memories of the descendants themselves, right? It is about time. This is 2021, and you have those organizations that, let me just point out that, students still take school field trips. Schools still organize field trips, and they take these young kids to places like the Ranger Museum, and they're still getting this fake history. I don't know what else to call it. It is just pretty embarrassing, I would say, given how we just have an abundance of information. We can point to the Canales investigation, can point to other bodies of works out there, and this is still happening. So we really need your support. Thank you so much for the donations thus far. We still need your support to continue our programming. Thanks.
Well, on that,
yeah, just a sorry, a little Zoom moment there. Is this okay, Cecilia?
yes.
Okay, just to add on to that, I mean, it's ironic, I think, that this all began with our understanding that there was an anniversary, right? And that this was something that we could take advantage of. The other one coming up is the claimed bicentennial of the Ranger Force in 2023. And just to Sonia's point, it's not just that they generally represent this history in a way that doesn't take into account several generations of scholarship, is that they actively still celebrate some of the murderers of the 19 teens, right? So Frank Hamer, who threatened to kill JT Canales for exposing the crimes of the Ranger Force, is still a hero in Waco, right? That's your tax dollars. That's your tax dollars at work. Figures from the 19th century who tracked down people who were fleeing slavery and brought them back into bondage are listed and described in glowing terms. I mean, it's unbelievable. If you look at the people they still celebrate, it's like the civil rights movement never happened, right? Let alone even like the last 5 years and what this country has been through. They have huge plans for publicly celebrating the Ranger Force's history all over the state, right? I've pasted a link to those plans. I mean, this is more the sobering moment, right? So it's a little bit of a David and Goliath story, right? They have a budget, they have a formal arrangement with the state of Texas, but we want to make sure that they're forced to address these kinds of stories. And I think, leveraging what we've done and our scholarship and the scholarship of so many others, including some of the people who are on this call, I think that they might be surprised by how effectively we can do that. At least I hope so.
Trini, I think you had something to share before we conclude.
Just to echo everything that's been said about our future activities and the upcoming 2023 bicentennial, of Rangers, and at least the sense we're getting from how they're going to pursue that history. And this, it's likely, at least at this point, that it's not going to be an accurate, honest history. One that I don't think is going to be addressing the moral issues and questions that we're raising. But that can change. that can change through our collective efforts at addressing the museum itself, addressing how that history should be shared, because it's not simply the history of the Rangers, it's the history of Texas and all of people who live in Texas. And therefore it needs to be honest and accurate and truthful.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. And we are getting ready to switch over to questions, commentary. I want to draw your attention again to the chat. I posted the link to donate. This is my personal request. This is not from the team, but if any of you feel compelled to send that link by email to friends of yours or to share it on Facebook and spread the word a little bit, that would be extremely welcome. I also want to say thank you to Annette Rodriguez and also to Richard and Olga Rodriguez for their contributions. So at this point, we're gonna encourage you to type in some questions or just mention that you want to make a comment in the Q&A box. If you go down to the bottom of your screen on the right, there should be a little icon that says Q&A, and that will allow us to track any questions. But do we have anybody that wants to start with anything, any questions or comments?
Trini, are you back? Can we hear you, Trini? Because I think you were frozen and we lost you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just typing up that to everybody. I'm apologizing. I got disconnected. I don't know what part I got disconnected on. I'll just
you were ending with the museum and I think transitioning to other future plans.
This is just
I think
class, right?
That we can help put pressure on the museum itself, the Texas Ranger History Museum, and trying to address the sort of lack of scholarship that I think we're getting an indication of, and the lack of honesty. And I'll stop.
Okay, so we do have one in the chat, Cecilia.
Yes, Juan Carmona, do you want to share with us?
I don't know if Kim here. Does Ben have to promote him?
No, we can allow him to talk. We just have to do it from the attendee.
Okay.
I don't know. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you guys for allowing my students to participate in so many of your events, and really getting hands-on history with you guys, and sharing what they've learned with the with the larger community.
Juan, could you share with us a bit how they've responded? Have they shared with you what they experienced, what it meant to them?
Oh yeah. To begin with, they just get super excited discovering stuff as they're going through like the Canales Commission testimony and other documents and pictures they found on their own, and and then to share it with other people. It's been like a life-changing experience for some of them. Some of them ended up switching majors. Some of it, I honestly think I should get a commission for all the history majors I've switched. But other than that, they're just so glad and happy to have been participated in in different events with you guys, and then especially the 2019 100th anniversary. That was like I was especially proud that day with my students, and they were all moved that day. I can tell you that.
Can I add to that? Can I just elaborate to Mr. Garbona's comments? He's really underselling what he's done with his students. I mean, he had high school students researching these histories of La Matanza in local archives. And when they made their presentations for the historical unveiling of the marker of commemorating La Matanza in 2017, we had days of public history events and programming that included these student research presentations. And not only were we in tears, I mean, me and Sonia like sobbing at their incredible work, but they also found primary sources that as a group of scholars, we had never seen. They also developed, short documentaries, and they presented their research at the Bullock Museum in 2019, and also performed. They brought the Canales hearing testimonies, the drama of that hearing to life through performances, by reading testimonies, by reading the script. And they read, for example, some of the depositions that were written by survivors of the Bodnit massacre. They were bringing to life words that had not been heard in over a century. And so, the students, the power that they brought to the commemoration, for descendants like Benita Alvarado to be able to meet these students was a highlight for me, and wouldn't have been possible without the teaching of Mr. Carmona, but it also gives us insight into how transformative education can be if students have access to this history. So thank you, Mr. Carmona, who is an award-winning educator in his own right.
Thank you so much.
Just want to share in the chat channel that Erlinda has also shared with you the website where you can learn more about the Porvenir massacre, and including access to some educational resources. We have a question from a Mexican nation. The Rangers killed my great-great-grandfather in 1886. The story passed on to me stated that the Rangers made bets on which way he'd fall. Did Rangers behave in this manner with other victims?
Yes.
Yeah.
Would someone on the panel
Yes,
respond?
definitely.
Yeah.
So one of the things that they did a lot of that is they would string people up just to get answers, and this is something that they would do lots of these different tricks to just really scare them. There was a lot of fear tactics. There was a lot of terrorist tactics that they would do to them, and a lot of this really is part of their MO, is what they would do, and people knew that they were going to be doing these kind of things, and that they were left unchecked. So the answer, Jose, is really that yes, that this was a common tactic for them.
Well, and one of the things that really struck me during your conference in 2019 was to see those photos on the screen of the postcards that they made, including one for my hometown, Brownsville. Do any of you want to share what that is? Just the fact that they made these postcards, that they even that they even,
well,
I don't know if
the use of
that photo. Yeah.
Well, there's Rangers in the photos of the postcards. It depends which postcards you're looking at, but the use of postcards to depict violence against people of color wasn't just exclusive to Mexicans, right? It was also African Americans and Native Americans and others, right? So the use of photography to perpetuate that it was okay to engage in this violence, and not only okay, but to be celebrated. So you have some postcards where people say, look, I was at a barbecue, right? And they talk about somebody who was lynched and set on fire. They thought it was joke-worthy, which is interesting, because if you followed the recent hearing in Charlottesville, one of the things that the plaintiffs were showing is the use of humor as a way to shield racist commentary and intent in their actions. So the defense was, well, we were just joking, right? It's just a joke. You're being too sensitive. But humor in this manner is a mechanism towards justifying violence towards others, and it's problematic. And the postcards were a part of that sort of discourse of the time.
Thank you, Trini. I want to move on to another question. This is from Russell Contreras, who's a journalist. What efforts are being made to save other Mexican-American cultural sites? For example, Dolores Huerta's birthplace, Dr. Hector P. Garcia's original clinic, and what is at stake in preserving these sites? Does someone want to take that on?
If I may, we're not necessarily working on those, recognizing those sites. I think it would be wonderful if that were to happen. I think it's just really important to mark sites where these events happen, but also to celebrate those who have been standing up for the community for decades. And it's especially important given our climate, right? What we're facing in this country today. And so for many folks, like this is the history that they're going to get. Like, this is the critical history they're going to get, because it's difficult to get it in the classroom today. And so it would be wonderful to see, especially see a marker in honor of Dolores Huerta. And if I may, just really quickly, going back to the other question, I thank you to the gentleman who shared the story about his grandfather, and this is 1886. It's really important to point out that violence against Mexican origin people did not happen just overnight in 1910. I mean, this is an ongoing, this is also in reverberations of racial violence. It's really important to point that out. This is, this is ongoing. So not just in 1910. Thank you.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add to thanks to the gentleman who shared that horrific detail of his family history. And unfortunately, that was common to intimidate people and to dehumanize victims and to create terror and spectacles out of these events and these tragedies. To Russell's question, I thank you, Russell, for joining us. I wanted to say there's a lot more work that we have to do, not only on this topic, but just on commemorating Latinx history in the United States more broadly. That institutes like MACRI, the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, that has recently opened up in San Antonio, is doing important work to try to commemorate and record and document the civil rights movement for Mexican Americans. But there's also on the horizon, potentially, it's been approved, a Smithsonian Museum to Latinos in the United States. And being in some of the early conversations about what that could look like, there is the realization that the Smithsonian institutions and cultural institutions don't have objects and photographs and artifacts to help to tell Latinx history. And so the kinds of challenges that we saw when we were trying to help curate the Life and Death on the Border exhibit is a challenge not just for telling this part of the history of the border of Latinx history in Texas, but that is a challenge for public history at large. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done to preserve historic sites that Russell mentioned, to honor people. And so we really see our work in collaborating not just on this topic, but helping other historians become involved in this work, and public institutions like the Smithsonian or the National Park Service participate in preserving these sites. And so I thank him for that question, because there's so much work that we have to do.
Yeah, I think Russell also really smartly asks what's at stake in preserving these sites. And I think this leads us back to some of the reasons why we were interested in markers from the beginning, right? Which is that they're not just there sitting out in public with information, but that they're also in a sense endorsed by the state, right? They have to be approved. They have to be approved by the state. And I think if you don't get the kind of markers that we've done, or the kind of markers that Russell's question references, what you have are basically markers to the supposedly heroic white Texans, mostly of the 19th century. And it cements this idea that that is the real Texas history, right? And all this other stuff is some sort of special interest history, right? And it's not something that all of us need to know. So I think the marker question, even beyond the scope of what we're doing, is a really important one.
I want to call everyone's attention to the chat again, because Chris Carmona has shared another important link, which is a website with resources for teaching Mexican American studies in Texas public schools, which he's very involved in. I want to move on to another question we've got. Patricia Garcia says, every time I teach this history to students of many backgrounds, they ask why they haven't learned this history. They're also angry about it and not sure what to do with that anger. So it's amazing to hear about how students are engaging with this project. Can you share those resources with educators? And will you continue to work on pedagogy, both K through 12, as well as university resources? And she added a little PS, congrats to Dr. Martinez on her MacArthur grant, which recognizes her scholarly work and activism in public history. Which I second as well. It's a huge award, a great honor.
Thank you, Pat.
Yes. So I guess for the education, I think that we're always going to be doing that. And we are looking to expand our are resources to everyone out there for teaching, both at the K through 12 level and at the university level. And so, that's one of the reasons why we're doing this kind of fundraiser, so we can get resources to help put these things together, put them out there for everybody, and things that we've done, especially when we do those marker ceremony conferences, is that Monica has graciously done oral history workshop for our students, and on both of the counts. And so things like that, and having these talks and having this type of education really helps to bring the students into, and yeah, so we, using these different resources, and something we'll continue to develop, but we always invite more. If you guys have stuff in lesson plans or anything, we would definitely love to to incorporate them into what we have and to share it with the world. Yes.
I'd like to add,
go ahead.
Just to add to that answer, particularly about education real quickly, as a personal anecdote, and I shared this with a group a few months ago. When I was in 7th grade, I was taking Texas history like all of us do in Texas. And this is 79, 80. And so the textbook obviously is going to be reflective of that time period and how the story is told. And obviously the Rangers are told as heroes and as saviors, and the Mexicans as somehow not contributing or not really doing much, or, bandits, right? And my social studies teacher, my Texas history teacher, F. Garza, and I still remember his name. I think he's the only 7th grade teacher's name I remember. He stood up and he kind of stretched his polyester pants out with his thumbs. And he says, well, that's what the book says. But if you talk to the old people here, those rinches were not very nice, and they killed a lot of our ancestors, right? And so him doing that in the classroom, that was not in the textbook, but he added that, validated, at least for myself, the stories I was hearing from my family already, right? So that reflected a feeling of confirmation, of justification of the stories I was hearing as a kid, to say, yeah, okay, there it is. Here's a teacher saying it, and also pointing out that the book was lying, right? And that's the power of education on the psychology of a child that I think is very important to understand.
Thank you, Trini. Sorry, I jumped in. A few more thanks to Samantha Rodriguez and to Phyllis Barragan Getz and to Iz Gutierrez for your contributions. We're still receiving more support and very, very grateful for it. There's another question that was sent to us by Deb Vargas, and she says, I thought about this project when that photo of Border Patrol on horseback whipping Haitians along the US-Mexican border circulated around national press, because most of the conversation linked this to slavery. And although this is accurate, there was less connection to the legacies of the Rangers. I think your work is so critical for these kinds of racial discourses in this moment. Any comments on that?
Thank you, Deb. I'm going to put a Q&A, a link to a Q&A that I had with Slate shortly after those photographs were made public, and to say that, the students that I was in conversation with that were in my classroom at the time that those were made public made the connections between the history of violence by Border Patrol today, the culture of impunity that Border Patrol and federal agents enjoy today, and making connections to what they were reading about had taken place on the border 100 years ago. And so in a place like Texas, and in a place like along the US-Mexico border, these histories of anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-Asian, and anti-Mexican violence, these histories intersect. And the Texas Rangers played a role, as Ben pointed to earlier, as being slave catchers, enforcing chattel slavery, of committing acts of Native genocide, of policing the border during Chinese exclusion to prevent Chinese migrants from coming into the United States through Mexico. And certainly they built their tactics of police brutality and targeted American citizens of Mexican descent and Mexican nationals. And so those, depending on the histories that we know in US history, those photographs triggered either memories of long histories of anti-Black violence or also histories of anti-Mexican violence. And what to me that really signaled is that as a nation that we have so many histories of racist violence that we haven't fully confronted, but we also have to do the important work of understanding how they're interconnected, especially if we want to think about the ongoing need for social justice and reform for things like policing today, that if we don't think of these as interconnected, then we're only going to be doing piecemeal work and band-aid solutions rather than making real change. Thank you, Deb, for that question.
Right. Well, we've come to the end. We've had a very captive audience. Most of you have stayed with us for the full hour and a half. We really appreciate your investment and your curiosity and your commitment to these issues. Trini, do you want to share anything with us as we come to a close?
Yes, first, from RTF, we want to thank everybody again for joining us this evening as we explored and talked about what we did in the past, what we're planning to do as well, and the important work of what we're doing as a collective, not just RTF, but all of us as a community. And something that is a tradition within the Latino community and recognizing those that have gone on to the other side is to say the word presente. So if you can, on your own, if you will, please say that word in honor of the descendants and their families and those that have passed away already. So once.
Presente.
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 We also want to give a huge thanks to Daniela Cortez, who has been doing all of her social media, tweeting, Facebook posts. She was really instrumental in figuring out the logistics. So thank you, Daniela, for your support. I know the team is very grateful. And on that note, we've run out of time, but again, we hope that what was shared today will keep you thinking and keep you having conversations with other people about what you heard. Engaged with this team. There will be more public events in the future, and we look forward to having you there. Thank you for the community that you've created this evening. On that note, we'll say goodbye, and thanks to all the scholars of
Thanks to
Refusing
Cecilia
Forget.
for
Thank
hosting.
you,
Yes.
Thank you,
Cecilia.
Cecilia, for
Thank
hosting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cecilia.
My pleasure.
I'm gonna stop recording.